Hello, and greetings from the University of Notre Dame Press. I'm Kathryn Pitts, the Marketing and Publicity Director at the Press. We are delighted to be here today with our Books for Better Understanding author event series. Today's featured author is William C. Kashatus, whose book, William Still, The Underground Railroad and the Angel at Philadelphia, was published by Notre Dame Press on April 1, 2021. Interest in the book has been extraordinary. The first print run sold out in under a month, and we went back to print, and the book continues to sell briskly in both hardback and digital editions. I'd like to start by introducing William Kashatus. Professor Kashatus holds a doctorate in history education from the University of Pennsylvania. He curated Just Over the Line, Chester County and the Underground Railroad, which was recognized by the Journal of American History as a first-rate exhibit and model of outreach to the local community, and was winner of the American Association of Historical Societies and Museums Award of Merit. He is the author or co-author of 30 books, including Harriet Tubman, a biography, and In Pursuit of Freedom, Teaching the Underground Railroad. William Still has received exceptional early critical attention, including starred reviews in Forward Reviews and Library Journal, which called the book an essential work that is a must-read for those interested in the Underground Railroad and Black history in the US. Thank you, Bill, for agreeing to talk to us about William Still today.
Thanks for having me, Catherine. I really appreciate it. I look forward to our conversation.
Great. Okay, for our first question, 2021 marks the 200th anniversary of William Still's birth. What drew you to William Still as a subject of this biography?
As you mentioned in your introductory comments, I work for the Chester County Historical Society in Westchester, Pennsylvania. And that area is right over the Mason-Dixon line, and it was a hotbed of conflict between pro-slavery and anti-slavery elements in the antebellum period. So we, of course, did an exhibit on the Underground Railroad. And before that time, I had known about William Still's book. I'd known much less about William Still. But since Still was the point person on the eastern line of the Underground Railroad, it is centered in Philadelphia, a lot of the fugitives that came to him were sent through Chester County by his good friend Thomas Garrett, a white Quaker station master in Wilmington, Delaware. And to tell any story in an exhibit, you have to go through the history. And Still's book, published in 1872, The Underground Railroad, was really the most authentic source. So it was invaluable in our exhibit and telling our story. And as I did the research, I became more interested in William Still as really a historian, the first Black historian of the Underground Railroad. And the more and more I looked into his life, I thought he was a fascinating figure, an extremely heroic individual, a person of integrity, and really became committed to writing a biography about him.
So you mentioned William Still's book, The Underground Railroad, which he self-published in 1872. And I was wondering, is it still in print today? And what was his purpose in writing the book?
It still is in print. This is a copy, just to give you an idea of the 780 pages of that book. It still is in print today. This one was put out by the Ebony Classics, which is in Chicago. There are two other publishers that put the book out, continue to put the book out. But the reason I mentioned this 1970 reprint is because all the data that I provide in the book itself is cross-referenced with the pages that data appear on in the 1970 edition, because it is the most common edition used by scholars. The book is fascinating for several reasons. First, the reason why William Still wrote the book. He did so because, as the son of fugitives, he wanted to provide as much accounts of the people that he could, the fugitives that he helped, so after slavery ended, they could be reunited with their families. That was his primary reason in writing the book. There were other reasons, however. Second, I think it allowed the fugitives to speak for themselves, because other accounts that had been written on the Underground Railroad were written by white Quakers, specifically Wilbert Siebert and Dr. Robert Smedley. And they were white Quaker accounts that just told the side of the station masters, as if the fugitives were passive recipients of their generosity. And they weren't. I mean, if you read Still's book, you can see how intelligent these runaways were and how active they were in their own escape. So we wanted to tell their side of the story. Third, William Still wanted to demonstrate that a Black man could in fact write a very good history, and he wanted to refute the mythology of intellectual inferiority among Blacks. And the final reason he wrote this book was he was at a point in his life where he had just failed as a civil rights pioneer. And he failed as a civil rights pioneer because he refused to join in with a younger, more active, proactive generation led by Octavius Catto. And his reputation was sullied. And he came out with the book basically to resurrect his reputation and a positive slant on it. So he wrote the book for all that reason. Now, the reason it's called the most authentic source is because it is unlike any other sources on the Underground Railroad. It deals with a fixed population. As I found out, 995 slaves who came primarily from the state of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. Now, all other accounts that have been written, even the scholarly studies have been written, they look at random populations. And I think this is one of the reasons why I've been able to find some things in Still's Runaways that refute the findings of other historians, beginning with the earlier histories of white historians. You know, it is a fixed population. When the book came out in 1872, it was put out by Porter and Coates, Philadelphia publishers, who had the right to put it out for 1 year. The run was 10,000 and Still sold all 10,000 copies by 1879. That's why he self-published it. The book was for its day a modern wonder, because Porter and Coates used electrotype plates on a steam-driven flatbed press, and was able to churn this out pretty quickly. As a result, the book sold, depending upon binding, cloth or leather, between $4.50 and $6.50 each. And then, of course, the rights went back to Still in 1879, and he published 3 more editions: 1879, 1883, and 1886.
Fascinating.
That's a 780-page book, by the way, and the process of going through that book and needling and weeding out the 995 fugitives was, to say the least, challenging, because there's a Journal C that was never published, and there are repeats. There's 149 additional cases in Journal C that had never been mentioned in the book. So, you know, and there are repeats. in Journal C as well. So it was a challenge. It was a real challenge. I mean, that's why it took 20 years.
Fascinating. The subtitle of your book identifies William Still as the Angel of Philadelphia. What role did Philadelphia play in the Underground Railroad and in William Still's mission and work? And what was the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, and how did William Still come to work for them?
Philadelphia was critical in William Still's career for several reasons. First of all, Philadelphia was the one city in the Union at that period of time that had the largest Black population. It was some 20,000 members in a population, which was at that period of time 250,000 residents. And that was important because this free Black population was essential in helping him gather intelligence on runaways and also secreting fugitives between various stations in southeastern Pennsylvania and then northward into New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, and into Canada. So that's one reason Philadelphia is critical. Just as important, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia in particular, but Pennsylvania was founded by the Quakers, the Religious Society of Friends. And aside from the AME Church, the Quakers were probably the most active religious group, not only in abolitionism, but on the Underground Railroad. Now, I do have to make one important point here, one very important point when it comes to the Quakers. Mythology holds that every Quaker was an abolitionist and thus an Underground Railroad agent. No. The Society of Friends was the first religious organization in North America to write an anti-slavery petition in 1688. But back then there were Quakers and Quaker merchants in particular who dealt in the slave trade and owned slaves. This was a process that evolved within the hierarchy of the yearly meeting, in this case, Philadelphia yearly meeting. And in 1759, Philadelphia yearly meeting, the administrative body of Friends in New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, made it a cause for disownment for any Quakers to deal in slave trading. It wasn't until 1776 that the Quakers made it a cause for disownment to own slaves. And at that point, they washed their hands of the whole slavery issue as a religious body. They were more concerned about the purification of the Society of Friends rather than the freedom of slaves. There were, however, a minority of Quakers who continued to act on abolitionism, taking their crusade into the larger non-Quaker society, but they were a minority. Now, within that minority, they differed in approach. Some wanted immediate emancipation, some wanted gradual emancipation, some wanted to colonize freed slaves in Africa or in the Caribbean, others did not. And within that group, that minority, the most radical minority were those Quakers who acted on higher law or God's law and disobeyed, violated the fugitive slave law, and helped runaways escaped on the Underground Railroad. So a very, very radical minority of Quakers, and still relied on them to help him. Still acted on, yes, the higher law. He also acted on his ancestry and his own family, who were slaves. And he acted on moral suasion. All his arguments were of a moral tone. He would write editorials in the newspaper. He did not really act politically. But I think what's very important here is he was an integrationist. He wanted assimilation, and he saw the need to work together with whites to do this. That's not true of the subsequent generation of civil rights reformers.
Interesting. A unique and valuable part of your book is the appendix, which contains a database of runaway slaves interviewed by William Still between 1853 and 1861. Where What sort of analysis were you able to conduct on this data for your book? And how do these findings correct misperceptions about the Underground Railroad?
It's interesting because that multivariate analysis, I had completed that probably by 2015. I started this project in like 2002. But by 2015, that multivariate analysis had been completed. And I was astonished at the findings because they challenged directly, at least in five distinct ways, the historiography on the Underground Railroad. And I offered it to 12 publishers, and none of them were interested in it. Only when I agreed to wrap a biography of William Still around the findings did they become interested. But let me get back to your question. I had a database of 995 fugitives that I culled out from that 780-page book and Journal C. These were categorized by name, alias, date of escape, place of origin, whether there were children in the escape, whether they escaped in groups, whether there was violence on the escape, how much the slave was worth, what reward was being offered for the runaway, who their owner was, who helped them. Now, obviously, of those 995 slaves, I did not have answers for every single one of those variables, okay? But I did have enough to give me some substantive findings. When I did the multivariate analysis on them, looking at those variables and seeing which ones matched up and gave me significant patterns, I found at least 5 significant patterns that differed between Still's runaways and the historiography. The first dealt with means of escape. The historiography basically says that the majority of runaways escaped overland and on foot, and it marginalizes water escapes. But for Still's runaways, the most common means of escape was watercraft. That is boats, schooners, steamers, and that's consistent with the fact that many of them came from Maryland's eastern shore and they had easy access to the Chesapeake Bay. If you want to know particulars, there were 350 cases where means of escape is known out of those 995 slaves. 152 or 43% of them escaped via watercraft, whereas 42% escaped on foot, and then the remaining percentages were carriage, wagon, horseback, and railroad itself. So that's one significant challenge. I might also add that the most noted book of historiography on runaways was done in 1999 by Lawrence Schweniger and the great historian Dr. John Hope Franklin. It's called Runaways. And they did a statistical multivariate analysis, but their population was random, both on the eastern line and western line. So that was my real target. But, there were probably over 24 other books on the Underground Railroad that reinforced what Schweniger and Franklin found. So I'm really challenging all of them. My second finding that deviates from the historiography is the higher incidence of female escapes. The historiography stresses that single men between the ages of 18 and 32 compose the overwhelming majority of runaways, and that after 1850, with the passage of a stronger fugitive slave law, more women began to escape, but they did so in groups led by males. Well, that's not completely accurate when it comes to Still's runaways. Of the 967 runaways whose gender is known, 730 or 75% were male, and 237 or 25% were female. That's consistent with the historiography. But of the 334 runaways known to have escaped alone, 81% were males, 19% were female. So while it was not as common for women to run away alone, it did happen. The third finding deals with the value of the runaways and the rewards offered. I found that the rewards for Still's runaways were higher than the 5% total of the value of the slave that was assumed. In other words, the historiography claims that rewards offered was based on 5% or less of the fugitive's total value. Thus, a fugitive's worth $1,600 in 1860 would bring a maximum reward of just $80. But in Still's case, of the 73 runaways where a reward is given, 53 or 73% had a reward of between $150 and $500. And if the 5% theory is applied, those slaves would be worth between $3,000 and $10,000 each, which is extremely high for a slave, and that just didn't happen. So, that's, I think, another significant finding. Another huge finding was individual versus group escapes. Historiography claims that, as I already mentioned, single male fugitives ran away because they had few to no family ties and they tended to travel alone. In other words, those males with families and females remained in bondage in order to keep their families together. Well, I didn't find that. I found that the 995 runaways still assisted. 660 or 60% escaped in 173 groups of 2 or more members compared to 336 who traveled alone. And the largest group of runaways was 28. And that group consisted of 4 very large families. 5 other groups had 10 or more members. 20 additional groups consisted of 6 to 8 runaways, and all of them had family members. What that tells me is, unlike the historiography, which says that slave families remained in bondage to keep their families together, Still's runaways ran away to keep the family together. And finally, although because the margin size or the sample size is so small here, I'm sure that there will be some historians that say this is not really a very significant finding, but I think it is. I found that Black runaways were just as literate as mulattoes. The historiography claims that mulattoes were more prone to be literate than dark complexioned slaves because the mulattoes were house slaves and favored by the master. So they were more prone to be around books or maybe even learn from people within the master's house how to read, whereas the field slaves had very little opportunity for that. And that the mulattoes or the Black slaves, dark complexion slaves, would be the ones to run away. Well, of the 390 runaways whose skin color is known, 289 or 74% were Black compared to 101 or 26% who were described as mulatto. That's consistent with historiography. What's not consistent is the assumption that light-skinned slaves were more literate than dark-skinned slaves. Of the 69 cases where literacy is known, 36% of the mulattoes were literate compared to 33% of the Blacks. That's not an appreciable difference. It really isn't. So what I'm finding is that Blacks, the runaways, whether they were dark complexion or light complexion, were just as literate. And in fact, some of the Black or dark-hued slaves were more literate than the light-skinned runaways. So that's what my multivariate analysis yielded. But I think it's important to note that that book, the appendices, is very large. It has the entire database of the 995 runaways. And I am trying to get the University of Notre Dame to put the Excel database online. So those historians who want to work in this field in the future could find other patterns. But I do think these findings are significant. And I do hope that in the future, whoever writes about the Underground Railroad, or at least the Eastern Line, they will have to deal with these findings.
Fascinating analysis of that. Do you think that there's an application of this material for general readers or genealogists tracing their African American ancestors?
Well, I do think there's an application, definitely for genealogists, because like William Still wanted to unite these families separated in slavery. You know, one of the reasons I pursued this is because maybe that didn't happen, but maybe now we could provide some African Americans with greater knowledge of their family ancestry because they have the data at their disposal now. So that's one audience. What I'm also hoping, and I make this point at the end of the book, and it deals with Still's legacy. William Still, as I said earlier, did not make a smooth transition between abolitionist and civil rights pioneer, because after the Civil War was over, he clashed with a younger generation of civil rights activists. That younger generation believed in direct action, confrontation. They did not really want to work with whites, only if they were white politicians who could further their cause. William Still disagreed with that approach. He was one who worked through the white mainstream, moral suasion. He did not want to, contrary to his involvement on the Underground Railroad, afterwards, he didn't want to rock the boat with the white mainstream. And I think that Still probably would have been the greatest reformer to come out of Philadelphia, greater than Octavius Catto, if he had just worked with that younger generation. Because the point I try to make is that there is a dialectic in the Black approach to civil rights. And one part of that dialectic is moral suasion and working through the courts and through the political system. The other is direct action and confrontation. And we see throughout history that both of those approaches are necessary. You just can't go one way. Both approaches are necessary if we're going to affect civil rights reform in this country. And that's what I think we have to learn. I mean, we still, in many respects, our country, with the events that are happening in our country, we're back in the 1850s all over again. And there is going to be a racial confrontation in this country unless we as Americans, not just Blacks, not just whites, get our acts together and work together. This is not just Black history that we're talking about. It's white and Black history. It's our history. We are all Americans. We all want the same things for ourselves, for our children, and our grandchildren. And if we march to a different drum, if we go our own way, we are never going to solve this problem. We need to work together.
Okay, moving backward into the book, how was William Still affiliated with John Brown and Harriet Tubman?
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you saw the movie Harriet Tubman, which came out, I guess, last year. I was very disappointed in it. I was very disappointed in it because that movie gave the impression that William Still and Harriet Tubman were very good and close friends. They weren't. In fact, Thomas Garrett, who was given a cameo role in that movie, was very close with Harriet Tubman. It wasn't William Still. In fact, as much as I admire William Still, I do have to admit that he was kind of jealous. He was jealous of people like Frederick Douglass. He was jealous of people like Harriet Tubman because they got a higher billing than he did in the Underground Railroad. And in addition to that, still, although I do admire him, he was an elite or an elitist. And he felt he was better, particularly than those who were not educated, who were not literate. And he felt that those Blacks were responsible for the stereotype of Black inferiority. So he really kind of distanced himself from Harriet Tubman. Yes, he worked with her, but if you go through his book, she's not mentioned all that much. Whereas there's a completely different situation in the relationship between Thomas Garrett and Harriet Tubman. John Brown's another case. He was close to Still. In fact, after Harper's Ferry, Still gave sanctuary to two of his raiders, and he actually even agreed to accompany John Brown's wife down to Virginia to attend the trial. But in the end, she and he decided it wasn't the wisest thing to do. Now, one very important thing about Still's relationship with John Brown is that when John Brown was taken into custody, there were papers that were found in his belongings that basically incriminated Still and revealed his relationship with him. Immediately when Still found that out, he took all his journals in which he was doing these interviews and these writings, and he hid them in a crypt in Lebanon Cemetery. So he, his activities wouldn't be discovered. And then, of course, after the 13th Amendment was passed, he recovered them, and then he started writing his book. But Still was well connected. He knew every major abolitionist as well as Underground Railroad operator of his time. And he worked, for the most part, he worked together with him very, very well.
Great. Kalisha Graves, one of the early readers of William Still, said that the book expands the bandwidth of African-American historiography on the Underground Railroad and William Still. Can you discuss how William Still's story and the history of the Underground Railroad has been misrepresented and ignored by the Academy?
One thing I found, and we would, at the Historical Society, we're very, very fortunate to have African-American historians like Jim Horton, Emma Lobsansky of Haverford College, and the late Jim McGowan, the biographer of Thomas Garrett, and Harriet Tubman. We were very fortunate to have them on the advisory committee because they emphasized the importance of oral history in the African and African-American tradition. Blacks traditionally have told their history in an oral format, not written documentation. And the Academy, and I think it's changing now, but the Academy emphasizes if it's not written, it's not history. And we just wouldn't have been able to do that exhibit had we not done that, because we did have another committee of Chester County residents, African-American residents, that helped us on the exhibit, and they gave us tremendous help in putting together the exhibit and the history of the exhibit. But it was all through oral tradition and what had been passed down in their family. So that's one thing that I am hoping. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, my history here that I've told in Still's biography is all documented. It's all documented. But Still, I think, would give credence to that oral tradition. I think that's very, very important. I think the Academy right now is facing a crossroads, especially with the increasing numbers of young African American historians who are publishing works. There is a tendency to become more presentist with this younger generation. That is to evaluate history based on moral conventions of the 21st century and imposing them on people who lived 150 years or more. And you can't do that. You can't do that. You just can't do that. There are some historians that have looked at both Black and white figures who have done so much in the history of civil rights and emancipation, who these young historians consider racist. And that's a concept that didn't really even have much weight back, in the 1850s. And those people who were being called racist were some of the most progressive people of their time period. And I'm not just talking whites like Abraham Lincoln or Lucretia Mott. I'm talking about Blacks too, whether we're talking about Frederick Douglass or even the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So I think we have to move back to center here. And that's my concern. That's a big concern.
You mentioned earlier how this book can fit into current issues that are going on in the United States. How is William still important to readers in the US during this moment of reckoning with systemic racial inequality? And who would you like to read William Still, The Underground Railroad and the Angel at Philadelphia, and why?
Well, I think pretty much I just kind of covered that in my last response. It is, look, there is no question that we, not just as historians, but as Americans, have to admit that slavery is part of our history. So are other social injustices. We have to admit that. And we have to study it and we have to learn from it in order to move forward. However, I disagree with the conclusions, once again, of the current generation of African American historians, many of whom believe that in the radical conclusion of that basically our country was founded on racism, that the Constitution is racist, that people who gave their lives, both white and Black, to advance the cause of emancipation and civil rights were racist, and that because the system doesn't work, it should be overthrown. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. And I think, I know William Still wouldn't have agreed with it. He was an integrationist. And my hope is that the current generation of historians, both Black and white, will read the book and learn from Still's example. And let the statistics tell the story. Let him tell the story. Because we are. Obviously, there's no question that racism in this country is systemic. We have a long way to go. But again, we have to work together. If we as whites and Blacks don't work together, this situation is just going to get worse. It's just going to get worse.
Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our time. I wonder if you have any brief closing comments about how your book should matter to readers today and for readers in the future.
Hopefully it will be a model of responsible history. Look, William Still was not a saint. He was a human being. And human beings have shortcomings. They make mistakes. I think I've shown that between the pre-Civil War William Still and the post-Civil War William Still. I mean, he was a great abolitionist, but he was, not as good as a civil rights pioneer. And we have to remember, again, people who historical figures, people who lived 100 years ago or more, they were people, and we have to judge them as such. We have a tendency to canonize them on one end or excoriate them. I mean, we've seen this with the founding fathers for the last, I don't know, 60 years. And now we're seeing it with, more common figures like William Still. Again, there's got to be middle ground, and I hope that's what I've showed. I've tried to be as objective and as responsible as possible in telling his story, and I hope other historians will follow that lead in whoever they write about.
Well, I want to thank you, William Kashatus, for participating and being here today and speaking with us. Thank you for your insight, and thank you for your beautiful book, William Still, The Underground Railroad and the Angel at Philadelphia. It's available wherever books are sold, and we encourage you to visit and support your local independent bookstore, either in person or online. Or you can order the book through Notre Dame Press, through the Notre Dame Press website at undpress.nd.edu. Take care.